Traffickers can claim victims anywhere at any time, and no one knows this better than Holly Austin Smith. Her story is heart-wrenching. In 1992, at the tender age of 14, she'd been sexually abused by a distant relative for years. She had virtually no relationship with her parents and was contemplating suicide. Things changed on a dime. A seemingly cool older boy she met at a local mall expressed interest in her. He convinced her he could give her a new life as a fashion model, promising her wealth and fame. Holly was easy prey and primed to be his next victim. She agreed to run away with him. Instead of a glamorous new life, Holly was whisked off on a horrific 36-hour odyssey. During that time, she was prostituted, raped, and assaulted. The ordeal ended when she asked law enforcement for help. If she hadn't had that encounter, Holly might still be under the control of her captor. Holly remained silent for 17 years. Then she finally found her voice and a way to heal her wounds. In 2011, Holly testified before the U.S. Congress on the need for tougher anti-trafficking laws and began working with survivors of trafficking and sexual assault. Her book, Walking Prey, sheds light on commercial child trafficking in the United States. I recently sat down with Holly Austin Smith in Washington, D.C., where she shared her deeply personal story. So for people who aren't familiar with your story, you're like a lot of 14-year-old girls, trying to find your way, and then suddenly your life takes this dramatic turn. Tell people what happened.
So it was the summer between 8th grade middle school and 9th grade high school. And like many teens in that time frame, I was struggling in a lot of ways. I was depressed. I was afraid of losing my friends in high school. I was afraid of getting beat up. And I just felt very unvalued by a lot of people around me. I was always looking for a connection out there in the world with someone. One day at the mall, I was sort of straggling behind my friends, and I noticed this guy looking at me, and I held his stare, thinking he would look away, and he didn't. He motioned for me to come over to him. And that was really surprising and shocking, and at first I shook my head no, and I kind of looked around to see if anyone noticed this guy gesturing to me, and nobody noticed. And so I got really curious about what he wanted, and I felt really special that he pointed me out of the crowd. And I also felt like I had to go over there because I'd been waiting to make a connection with someone, and if I didn't go over there, it was never going to happen again. This was my window. So I walked over, and the exchange happened very fast. He gave me his phone number, and he took my phone number, and he said he would call, and so I kind of walked away feeling like, not really sure what to make of it. And then he started calling me at home that night, and in 1992, we didn't have cell phones, so I had a teen line in my bedroom. So my parents didn't know that I was talking to a stranger because I was always on the phone, talking to friends. And we talked on the phone for about 2 weeks, and he said things to me that made me feel good. Like, he said I was pretty enough to be a model, that I was too mature for high school. He just said things that a young teen girl wants to hear. And he also painted this glamorous lifestyle that he lived. He said that he traveled across the country, and that he met famous people, and he went to famous dance clubs, and that if I ran away, that I could do that too, and that he could get me into Hollywood, and I could be a songwriter or a musician or a model. And so I thought about those things, and as high school was looming in my future and I was struggling at home with my parents, I made the decision to run away. But within hours of running away, this person ordered me into prostitution in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So it was like that. I went from being a middle school girl to being on the streets of Atlantic City. It was very fast.
Why do you think you were vulnerable, and why do you think he's in a mall, he could have picked any young girl, but he focused in on you? I mean, what was it about you that was a signal for him? Because I'm sure there are other girls just like you who fall prey like this.
He was standing in a payphone booth I'm assuming pretending to be on the phone, and he was just watching the crowd. And if you were looking for a vulnerable girl, you would have seen that in me. The way that I was dressed, it suggested that I was looking for attention in a negative way. I was looking for attention from boys. I was straggling behind my friends, and I just looked very detached. But who knows how many girls he tried to connect with and how many didn't respond, but I responded. So you have to have both sides. You have to have someone who was specifically looking to exploit a kid, and then a kid who was vulnerable enough to respond to the attention.
You were under his control for about 72 hours, is that right?
It was about 2 days.
There's this chance encounter with a police officer, and you kind of give him some grief, but then almost like that, you make the right call, and one would assume when you're reading a book like yours, oh, she's saved, it's a rescue, this is great. But it really kind of gets at the heart of a lot of the problems. And problems don't just start in the beginning where you're a vulnerable girl, easy prey. They also start on the back end too. The police treat you like a criminal. Walk us through what happened.
Well, yeah, so I was spotted by a law enforcement officer the second night. I was out on the street, and he came up to me and he asked me how old I was, and I gave him the fake birthday. There were two people sort of in charge of me, and they told me what to say to police. They gave me a fake name and a fake birth date. And I stumbled over the birth date because I couldn't remember the year. And so the officer yelled at me to not lie to him. And so then I sort of created a fuss and started yelling like the people told me to do in order to deflect that attention, I guess. And it worked, and he threw up his hands and he walked away from me. And as he was walking away, I thought, if I don't say something, this is going to continue. I don't know where I'm going to wind up tomorrow. And I didn't want to be alone with that man again because he had raped me. Even though maybe I didn't understand that I had been raped, I understood that I had to have sex without consent. But, you know, and my idea of rape is sort of like violent, and the victim is screaming no, and I wasn't screaming no because I was a 14-year-old kid, and I said that I didn't want to, and I wanted him to stop. And when he didn't, and I didn't run out the room and try to get away, I felt like I sort of conceded. So I didn't understand that I was a victim of rape. But I knew that I didn't want to be alone with him again. So I called out to the officer, what if I was under 18? And what I meant by that was, what are my options? Because I didn't want to be out there anymore, but I also didn't want to go home. When I had decided to run away, it was a very real decision. I wanted a better life. And, but the officer arrested me, and he was very angry. And he called me names on the way to the police station. And I don't say that to shame the officer. I say that to stress the need for training and education to officers, especially when working with child victims.
At this stage, the police take you into custody, and they're asking you to basically, through this process, turn in the pimp, turn in these two people that you're involved with, but you're still struggling with everything, and then they're kind of feeling like you're uncooperative.
Right.
And then you're returned home when you should probably be in psychological counseling. You walk through all of this stuff. So talk to us about some of the cautionary tales that come out of your book in terms of how to deal with these young kids who, you know, the police identify them as prostitutes, but they're really victims.
When I present and speak about my story, and something that I stress in my book is those victims who are often called willing victims. So if a law enforcement officer comes across a child who is tied to a bed or beaten up and being forced into prostitution, then it's very clear to the officer that that child is a victim, and it's probably clear to the child as well. But if you come across a child who comes from a history of, say, poverty, and maybe a history of child abuse, child neglect, sexual abuse in childhood, if a child has experienced setbacks or exploitation a number of times, by the time they meet a trafficker, then that child may not necessarily realize that he or she is being exploited by a trafficker because exploitation has happened so many times already. Or that child grew up in a way that they didn't have resources available to them, whereas now this trafficker is offering a home and food and money and clothes, and so they think that they're in a good place. They don't understand that they're being victimized. So if you have a kid on the street who appears to be a willing participant in prostitution, it could be unclear to law enforcement officers that he or she is a victim. And so what I say in my trainings to law enforcement is that any child in prostitution or any other form of commercial sex work is a victim in need of compassion and resources.
You've mentioned the one S word, survivor, but you've also talked about two other S words that are kind of also pieces in all of this, shame and stigma. For people out there watching, what would your message be about those two words?
When I was arrested by law enforcement, I felt very shamed by the officer. And then when I was handed over to my parents, who really didn't understand what had happened, they just knew that I had run away and that I was being uncooperative with law enforcement, they also projected onto me the idea that I had made the choice to do this and that it was shameful. So I just felt very ashamed. And then on my first day back at school, my friends had learned about what had happened over the summer. And they called me names at school, and I didn't even make it through the first day of high school because I felt so ashamed. So I would say to the public that you have to realize that children who are in prostitution or other commercial sex work are victims. They're in need of compassion and support and services.
One final question. You never know. I mean, we live in this global community now. You never really know whose eyes are watching something like this. If there's a young girl or boy out there struggling right now, what would be your message to them?
My message would be that it's not your fault, and you didn't do anything to be ashamed of, and to reach out for help. Pick up the phone and call someone for help, and never stop trying to seek help and to achieve your dreams.
Holly Austin Smith, thanks so much for your courageous book and for talking to us.
Thank you.
Coming up, this week's close-up on art for the sake of human dignity and freedom.